A nice transition is doing one solution, of course, we get to talk about feedback anyway. What's that magic? Anyway, so thank you for coming. We also want to thank the people.
Okay, first thing, can you hear me? Oh, great, good. Well, thank all of you for coming. I got here at about 5:45, very empty in here. And I thought, oh, maybe some people have started poking around out in their gardens. Possible. Snow's almost out of my yard. Or maybe you're grilling or doing something kind of spring like. But what a great crowd. I'm very appreciative that you're all here. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about, well, this is probably my favorite topic to talk about. And I've been, as Tyler said, I've been working with waterbirds in the Great Lakes region for more than 30 years. I actually started working with piping plovers in 1981. I was a faculty member on the Duluth campus. And I got a very small grant, started working with a graduate student there up in Lake of the Woods with a small plover population, which became smaller and smaller. And now it's like 1 or 2 pairs, that's all. But mainly I'm going to be focusing in the state of Michigan where the bulk of the plovers are. So I'm just going to get going here. And we're going to be talking about recovery of the Great Lakes population, which is a federally listed population. And if anyone has questions, oh, I have to turn this on. Got that part. Yeah. If anyone has questions, just raise your hand as we go along. So my goals tonight are to cover some different topics. I want to start out by reviewing the natural history of the population, by then identifying what we call recovery actions, and then talking about some specific research examples, and finally evaluating where are we in this recovery whole recovery process. So the piping plover is one of 4 highly imperiled shorebirds that breed in North America that have been listed by the North American Shorebird Group. And you see the piping plover up there in the left-hand corner. And the other species that you may be familiar with are the long-billed curlew, the mountain plover, and the buff-breasted sandpiper. And this status was derived from different categories of their numbers and threats to habitat and so on. But the piping plover is listed as being and considered the most imperiled of all the shorebirds. And there are a large number, more than 70 species in North America. Just to give you a little bit of an idea about the global distribution of piping plovers, they are found only in North America. They breed in both the U.S. and Canada, and they basically only winter in the U.S. and Canada, except for a few birds that do get down into Mexico, that's the blue, and into the Caribbean. But most of them are in the U.S. and Canada. So quite some time ago, people came up with a delineation regarding the distribution of piping plovers and decided that they were divided into 3 populations, breeding populations. And the one on the Atlantic coast you see in green, that's the Atlantic coast population. And then the one in the interior, the yellow or gold, that's referred to as the Northern Great Plains or Great Plains Prairie Provinces population. And then within the circle, kind of the reddish, rust-colored spots in there, that's the Great Lakes population. So the North American Shorebird Group has gathered data in the time period of 2006 to 2010 and averaged population estimates and have come up with these different estimates for the different populations. So during that time period, the average was 54 pairs in the Great Lakes. Now, in fact, we have more than that. I'll tell you that in a minute. But that was the average at that time. The Atlantic coast had about 1,800, and the Northern Great Plains had about 2,300. So in total, it's a little bit more than 4,000 pairs or 8,000 plus individuals. So that seems like a fairly large number, but it's actually a very tiny number. And especially when you look at the Great Lakes, 54 pairs is a perilously low number, but not as low as it once was. So I have to cover this part because it's an important aspect of what we know about the 3 populations. First, at the bottom, you see where I have it highlighted in yellow. I say the 3 populations are distinctive behaviorally. Well, the primary difference is that they self-identify with one of the 3 breeding populations. So a plover that hatches on the Atlantic coast is going to go down into the Florida, maybe Caribbean area, and it's going to go back and it's going to look for a mate. It's going to nest on the Atlantic coast. Bird that hatches in the Great Lakes is going to go back to the Great Lakes. One in the Great Plains is going to go back to the Great Plains. So somehow they self-identify. How much of that is learned? How much is genetic? Nobody studied that. But that's important to know because when people have looked at the 3 populations, they found that the Atlantic coast is genetically distinct from the interior, the Great Plains. And they've been divided into two subspecies. When you throw the Great Lakes into the mix, they're also genetically different from the Great Plains and the Atlantic coast, but not to the point that they could be referred to as a subspecies. It's not a major difference, but yet if you were a geneticist and you had blood from each of the three populations, you could tell them apart. So we've got a couple of different ways of measuring and describing the birds as being in these different populations. And in fact, that's very important for the Endangered Species Act. They have to be distinctive entities. Okay, so what do we know about the natural history and ecology of piping plovers? A lot. There's no other shorebird species in North America that has so many papers, so much research has been done. And a lot of that's because of their special status. And they are a migratory shorebird. Each of the populations is migratory. About 25% of their annual cycle is spent on the breeding grounds. Well, until relatively recently, that's mainly where all the work was done. Very little was known about what was going on during migration, what was going on during the winter. And as I'm sure you're aware, obviously to have a good conservation program, you have to have a full cycle program. You have to know what's happening in all parts of their life. So 75% of the time they're spending on the wintering ground. They eat invertebrates, and that's insects, spiders, marine worms, great diversity of organisms, and they use both fresh and marine coastal areas. And that's especially important to recognize for the Great Lakes and the Great Plains. They're both nesting in fresh water, but wintering in a coastal zone. So what do we know about their reproduction? They nest on the ground, and they have a very simple, we refer to their nest as a scrape. If you were to see it, you'd say, well, that doesn't look like much. But if you look at it closely, it's actually kind of cool. So they dig it out with their feet, and then they'll line it with little tiny little stones, and then put the eggs into the center of the nest cup, obviously. And they're very well camouflaged. So they're essentially only lay 4 eggs. They always lay 4 eggs. There can be some exceptions, but basically they have a 4-egg clutch. So not like a chicken. You're not going to go and find a plover nest with 15 eggs in it. The incubation period is about a month, about 26 days. When the chicks hatch, they are precocial, and they are wet when they hatch, and within a few hours they're dry and they're up and they're running around. Their eyes are open, and they feed themselves. So they're, like very much like other precocial young, like a young chicken, so to speak. And the adult has the main function of keeping them warm and taking them away from danger and taking them to a good food source. But the adults do not eat them. So they are in the chick stage for they're able to fly after about 23 days, but they don't do too much flying until they're almost a month old. And both of the parents, they exhibit biparental care. So both male and female are important during incubation, because they take turns, and during the first part of caring for the young. But after the young are about 2 weeks old, the females do something that's somewhat unusual with birds and other vertebrates. They leave a migration. And the male remains then and looks after the young. And why the females leave early, we don't know, but they do leave a migration. We get reports, and I'll tell you about one of them a bit later. And they go on down to Florida or Georgia, or wherever they're going to send the widows. And some people have said maybe it's because they've basically used up their energy supply taking care of the young, and they need to use what they have left to get back down to the wintering grounds. Maybe they need to get to the winter and start to build up their energy reserves, we don't know. Question that may never be answered. So the males and the females look different, but not a lot different. So it takes a little practice, and there are two photos in the bottom. So the male has dark, where they have black, his is really black, and the female is less dark, you might say. His band is typically all the way across the chest. Hers may get like real thin, like right in the middle. And more brightly colored beak, and that head band is dark in the male, and it comes down and touches his eyes. So if you have a male and female standing together, you can usually tell the difference. But it's not like a male and female cardinal. That's for sure. Okay, so what do we know about this historical distribution? This is like around 1900. And the estimate is around 200 to 300 pairs. And currently, this past summer, there were 70 pairs that were nesting in the Great Lakes population. So you can see there were more birds, but it still was a very small population. Great Lakes has never been a big population. And they were distributed throughout all the states bordering the Great Lakes and into Ontario, and distributed around all of the five Great Lakes themselves. So I'm going to just take a minute to say something about Minnesota, because this is kind of interesting. So there's history of breeding in the Duluth Superior area, and that site no longer has breeding plovers, but they periodically, there's one or two that are seen during the breeding season or early in the spring. And they are birds from here because they're banded, so we know where they came from. And that suggests to us that this group, this area, and the birds that nested here are part of this, what we call the Great Lakes population. Well, then if you go over to the Lake of the Woods area, those birds, the Great Lakes birds don't show up over there. And we know from banded individuals that they've gone over to Manitoba, mainly Manitoba. And so that part of Minnesota and the plovers there are considered part of the interior of the Great Plains population. That's for those of you that want those details. Okay, so the numbers of piping plovers got so low in the 80s, down to 12 to 17 pairs, that they were proposed for listing on the Federal Endangered Species Act. And if you take a look, you think of that previous slide that I showed you, and then you look and see how few, at this point, at the point of listing, the reduction in nest sites or locations where nests were found went from about 60 around the turn of the 1900s to about 6 sites in the 1980s. So they were functionally extinct, or almost basically extinct at the time of listing. And this was around the time that I started working with my graduate students on trying to recover this population, bring the numbers up. So how did they get so rare? How did the numbers drop? Well, remember, they started as a small population. So you have a small population, makes it more vulnerable, easier for the numbers to be reduced. So early in the 1900s, we know of a couple things that were going on. One was market hunting, and a lot of shorebirds were shot and eaten. They were a great source of fresh meat before we had any poultry markets and so on. And many species of shorebirds were harvested. How many were harvested in the Great Lakes region? We don't know. Were they harvested? We don't know at all. But they were harvested elsewhere. They show up on records on the East Coast, so we're assuming some were probably taken to the Great Lakes. Another kind of an interesting one is scientific collecting. So around the 1940s and 50s, museums were really starting to build their collections. Piping plovers are rare. Everybody wanted a piping plover. They're easy to find. They nest on open beaches. And so professional collectors went to these beaches, communicated with each other, collected eggs, chicks, adults, and so on. And you'll find them in all the major museums in North America. And I have some records that show collectors going to different sites in Michigan and basically taking everything they found. Maybe it was like 4 pairs. Somebody would go one day and get the male, somebody the next day get the females, and then they took the eggs while they're at it. And plovers have never gone back to those sites. So I'm sure scientific collecting had an impact on this small population, but we don't know to what extent. So that's not going on now. So what are some of the other kind of bigger issues that are happening now or that happened historically? Public recreation. Well, plovers like the most spectacular beaches in the Great Lakes, just like people do. So the swimming beaches and so on were designated prior to the time that anyone knew that plovers were rare. And so there was historically a conflict there. So if you go through and look at all the big parks, like Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, Illinois Dunes State Park. These parks were established on these beautiful beaches, and plovers were there too. So that had an impact, and plovers, as they declined, no longer were using those beaches. Now, as they're recovering, they're going back to those beaches, and the park superintendents and biologists are embracing and welcoming plovers and finding ways for people and plovers to live together. Shoreline development, you all know, people love to build their homes, condos, whatever. So that's another issue that causes loss in habitat. And predators are an important issue because we think, and other people say this, the predators that you find in association with humans seem to be on the rise. There are more great horned owls, there are more raccoons, more skunks, and then you can even put that, move it outside of actual wildlife and talk about dogs and cats, feral dogs, feral cats, and people's pets that they allow to kind of roam around. And so we have documented cases of predation by all of those species that I mentioned. Okay, any small population also has to worry about what we call stochastic or random events. And so you are aware of at least 2, maybe 3 of these issues. So hurricanes, we know that hurricanes are one of the biggest threats for adult survival during the winter. Adult survival is lowest in years that have greater frequency and size of hurricanes. But it's a little bit of a mixed bag because hurricanes create great habitat. So sometimes the following year, where a hurricane's been through, there's an area that's really colonized, so to speak, by plovers on the East Coast. In the Great Lakes, we've had an increase in botulism E outbreaks, and that's associated with the invasive mussels, the quagga mussels and the zebra mussels. As they die, they create the conditions where there's no oxygen and where botulism E, the toxin, begins to develop. And then fish pick it up, and fish die and wash ashore, and then beetles and so on come to feed on the fish, and they pick up the toxin, and then the plovers feed on them and end up getting botulism. We've not had a lot of deaths, but we've had a handful. Excuse me. So you're probably wondering about the Deepwater Horizon spill. Fortunately, the birds were already on the breeding ground when that happened, or it would have been a disaster because the oil came ashore and birds are feeding on the shoreline. So we were greatly relieved, but everybody was worried about what happens when they go back in the fall. So Fish and Wildlife Service put a lot of money into monitoring plovers as well as other species. And I can't tell you really what they found. What they were trying to figure out is, did birds that winter in the areas where the oil spill was most intense, um, did they get oil on their feathers? And people did report that, but by the time they got back, most of it was cleaned up. And then what happened when they came back to breed? Did they survive the winter? Did they come back to breed? So we gave the people who were collecting these data information on our birds, but because this is still a pending lawsuit, nobody can talk about it. So sorry, I can't tell you. I don't even know. But we don't see a difference in our population. Numbers didn't go down. That doesn't mean there wasn't an effect, or birds somewhere might have been affected, but it's not anything that we can just look at and measure. But yeah, sure. Yeah. So we have not done anything, no blood sampling for contaminants, and um, mainly it's because Fish and Wildlife Service hasn't shown an interest, and it's difficult with an endangered species to get those permits. But we've talked about it, so thanks for asking. Um, well, another big environmental uncertainty is climate change, of course. So there's Lake Superior ice cover in 2009, and Lake Superior ice cover 11 March 2012. That's different than you'd find today, isn't it? I know the Great Lakes are just starting to open up a few places, like Lake Erie, but I think Lake Michigan is pretty solid. I think Lake Superior is, pretty closed over. And this is important for plovers because the amount of ice cover influences lake levels. It influences how much scouring of the shoreline goes on, which is very important because plovers live in a zone of change. They need to have the shoreline scoured because they nest in small cobble and no vegetation. And if that doesn't happen and there's plant succession, so if there's no ice, which there had been no ice for quite some time until last year, the their shoreline, their habitat gets grown up with plants, and they don't nest there. They wander around and look for other places. So what's going to happen with climate change? We don't know. We do know that females are nesting earlier, and so are males, because they have to do that together, right? Okay, so I hope I've made case now that this population is vulnerable. That has a lot of risks, and it's very tiny. And at the recovery time, 12 to 17 pairs. It's just, it's hard to imagine. So small. And I should say, because you might be wondering, they are quite easy to find. First of all, even though much time has elapsed, you'll find them on most, well, if you go back to the historic beaches where they occurred, many of those have been reoccupied, currently being used. So there's a signature on the landscape they like. And they like a narrow shoreline. Excuse me, they don't like a narrow shoreline. They want it to be wide from the water's edge to the trees. They like sand covered with cobble. Those are important. They like points of land. They like places where a little river goes in, where they can kind of feed on the little deltas. So the at the time when they were listed, they were proposed by way of a petition. That's how the process works. And they were first put on the endangered species list in 1986. And one of the first things that has to happen that's required under the Endangered Species Act is that a recovery plan is written. So there was one written back in like 1988. Then it was revised, so the one that we work off of now is from 2003. And so what is a recovery plan? Well, I said it's required as part of the Endangered Species Act. And I like to think of it as a recipe for recovery. Probably a couple hundred pages, one for pike and plover. And it goes through, identifies the regulatory agencies that are responsible for protection, but most important, a team of people got together and they put together a recovery action outline. That's the recipe part. So if you go down and you look at what all is called for, you know what to do and what needs to be done. And then there's a schedule of when this should be done. And the recovery goal is in every plan. And the recovery goal that was selected is 150 pairs. Now this was done before we knew a lot about estimating population size and really understanding the historical nature of this population, or really having much experience with modeling small populations. So some people argue that that's not a very good number, but it's in the recovery plan, so that's what we head for. So it's 100 pairs in the state of Michigan, 50 pairs elsewhere. They have to be at that number for 5 years before you can consider delisting. And they also are required to be producing a particular specific number of young per year on average, which I believe is about 1.7. Okay, so here are the specific recovery actions. Maximize survival and fecundity, and doing this through protection of the birds and through habitat management. Identify and protect the migration habitat. Conduct scientific research to facilitate the recovery efforts. Develop and implement public education and outreach. Got to make sure the public is engaged. And develop partnerships and additional funding mechanisms, partnerships of agencies, nonprofits, universities, and so on that are going to help with recovery. Develop emergency methods to prevent extirpation. So if a disaster really did strike, what would we'd have to be prepared maybe to deal with 10 remaining pairs. And finally, to evaluate progress towards recovery. So this is kind of a dry sounding list, and so I'm going to actually go through and talk a little bit more in more detail about how we're trying to address that. But first of all, so what's recovery all about? Ultimately, removing the species from the endangered species list. That's the goal through the Endangered Species Act. But what do you want to do? We want, the public wants, agencies want to ensure as many eggs, chicks, and adults as possible survive to contribute to future population growth and sustainability. So that survival can be taking place on the wintering grounds during migration, on the breeding grounds, and that's most of my work is focused on the breeding grounds, and so we spend a lot of time making sure everybody is staying alive. I guess that's the easiest way to say that. So, you can tell there's a lot of energy that goes into this. Not very many birds, and why? What are the societal benefits of plover recovery? Well, first of all, the piping plover is what I call an umbrella species, in the sense that they're on the coastal. They're within the Great Lakes coastal ecosystem, and there are other rare species that occur within that same system. Several plant species that are federally threatened. There's an insect species. There's some other species of birds that they're not rare, but they are associated with that, found in that coastal system. So the plover has the federal protection. The land is being protected under the federal laws, and so it's like an umbrella. So everything else that occurs there benefits from plover protection. And so ultimately, protecting plovers contributes to coastal conservation, which is very important because there's tremendous pressure to develop coastal regions. Um, the, the plover, as an endangered species, engages the public in conservation. And that, of course, can lead on to concern and interest in other species. And ultimately, the new knowledge that we get by doing research on plovers is transferable to other shorebird species, other bird species of conservation concern, and simply, to plovers themselves. So I think there are definitely a lot of benefits. So how do we go about achieving recovery? So I'm at the University of Minnesota, and I've had 5 PhD students and 11 master's students who have been studying piping plovers for quite some time. And they've worked on the breeding grounds, on migration questions, and on the wintering grounds. And I'm going to talk to you tonight about just a handful of their contributions. But it's really not me. I've been, I kind of cracked the whip. I raised the money. I have lots of ideas. But these people, their hearts and souls have been poured into plovers. And what they produced is totally amazing. And because we have the numbers that we do today is due to them and a number of other stakeholders and support groups and so on. So where do we work? In the summer, most of the people, or the people who are working on the breeding season, are working in northern Michigan out of the University of Michigan Biological Station. It's right a little bit south of the Mackinac Bridge. Those of you that have been to Michigan would know that feature, which connects the upper and lower peninsula. But I've had students working in Cuba, Mexico, Florida, and the Gulf of Mexico looking at wintering issues. The recovery methods are actually so simple. It's hard, it's hard to imagine that they're so simple. But these have been very effective. One is when we find a nest, the beach gets closed if we can get permission to close the beach. And usually we can. Sometimes private landowners do not, you have to kind of work on them a little bit. And that simply means posting with a sign like that and putting up some other wooden stakes, and then you just take twine around it. So you mark off an area. So we might close an area, say as big as this, all the seats in the auditorium. And let's say the nest is like right in the middle. And so it's really a small part of the beach, and we try to keep the shoreline open so people can go directly along the shoreline. We try to keep it so people don't feel angry or threatened about it. And then the other thing we do, I'm not sure how well you can see, but we put up what we call an exclosure, which looks like a playpen. And it's made out of horse fencing. So it's got holes that are, about so big. And you put this up, and we put that blueberry netting that people cover their fruit crops with over the top, so things can't come in, like great horned owls or merlins or whatever. And then the horse fencing basically keeps everything out except like mink or weasel or ground squirrel. It keeps out raccoons, skunks, cats, dogs, foxes. There's a whole long list of things that would like to eat plover eggs. And the adult plovers go in and out right through those holes. And we get an exclosure up, and boom, they're back in. We don't put it up until they have their eggs, and then they're very attached to their eggs. We put the exclosure up, we sit back, we watch, and they go in, and it is very rare that they reject it. And this is real simple. And in fact, before we put those up, on average, only 40% of the eggs would hatch, because something would get them and eat them. And now we have over 80% that hatch. And why don't we have 100? Well, some eggs are not viable. They're not fertile. There's some problems. They don't hatch. And things like weasels or whatever get in there. Every once in a while, get some eggs. So, but this has been a huge boost to productivity because now we have a good way of picking. So, but remember, I said the young are precocial. So when they hatch, they go outside that exposure. They don't ever go back in. So that's when they are threatened, is once they get out and they're on the open beach. So other kinds of things, we have lots of ways of dealing with the public. We have volunteers. We produce videos, and when I say we, this is the larger group of stakeholders. I'll talk about in a minute. Have information kiosks. Whoops. One right up here. We have public presentations, brochures, news releases, and so on. Lots of ways to try and reach out to the public. Now, we have partnerships, our stakeholders, and we meet twice a year. Physically, we get together, pre-season, post-season meeting, and then we have a big long conference call planning the season. Who's going to be working where? What are the issues? Who needs what kind of equipment? And it's a big list of partners, and it's very impressive. Federal agencies, state agencies, the tribes, nonprofits, universities, and we have more than 20 zoos who were very involved, which I know you'll find interesting. And they are involved in what we refer to as our captive rearing program, which I'll talk to you about in just a few minutes. So a big part of what goes on the beach are we hire monitors. And there's basically no nest without a monitor. And monitors are checking. Most of them are employed by the different agencies, but we do have volunteers, like when it's on private land. And so people are checking. We get the exposures up. The monitors check to make sure that exposure is staying together. There's no openings or whatever. And the beaches are fenced off appropriately. And they check to see what's going on every day. Are both the birds incubating? You see both birds. They check their identity because of their bands. What stage are they in? If the egg's hatched, then they count the chicks, make sure all the chicks are there. And we get these reports all the time, at least on a weekly basis, sometimes more often than that. And so these monitors are trained. Very often they're university students with, needing jobs for the summer. So we have a training session for them up here. And they learn how to put up these exposures. They learn how to sex the birds and then identify them. And they learn about the breeding season and cycle, and so that they can keep good records. And they do a phenomenal job. So that's how, we reach out throughout the Great Lakes region and get the information that we need. We also have a big banding program. And this is really important because you can't track a population unless you know who the individuals are. And the more you know about the individuals, the more you know about the population. So since we started in '93 until 2014, over 500 adults have been banded and 1,700 plus chicks. And in a typical season, at the end, over 90% of the adults have been banded and up to 100% of the young. We don't always get everybody, but it's very, very high. And this is extremely unusual, and it's led to us being able to do a lot of different things with estimating their, what we call their vital rates, or the population metrics, their survival rates. So this is how we mark these birds. So we catch them in it's called a potter's trap. The adults put this trap over their eggs, except we take their eggs, put dummy eggs, so that they don't get eggs. We just hold the eggs in a little Tupperware container, cotton. And so we go in, put the trap down, put the fake eggs in. The adults are like having a fit, and they run in immediately, go into the trap, hit the treadle, door closed. And then we go pull one of them out, get it all banded, and release it within less than 10 minutes. and usually the other adult goes back in the nest, and that bird goes and takes a bath, tries to figure out exactly what happened to it. But so we put a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service USGS aluminum band on the upper leg, and then we put this orange, what we call flag, so that's the OF, which indicates Great Lakes. So the other populations have different colored flags. And then we can use whatever combos we want here. And each adult then is individually identifiable, which is very cool because not only do we get information during breeding season, but we get it during migration, and we also get it in winter to keep track. So what have we learned from the banding that aids recovery? Well, it's really powerful. You know, we know that the breeding populations are separate. It is exceedingly rare for, we've had 2 Great Lakes birds nest on the East Coast in over 20 years. And we had 1 bird from Great Plains come into the Great Lakes. So we just have 3 today. We know that the populations overlap and they mix. Great Lakes bird feeds next to an Atlantic coast bird in the winter, but they know where to go when it's time to breed. They can have high fidelity to their nest site and their mate, but only if the mate is alive or shows up in time. Otherwise, they're going to be switching mates around. So it's not, you know, people like to hear about, you know, mating, breeding, mating forever. Well, that doesn't happen with plovers. It's actually quite rare because one mate will often die or it's slow getting there, and the other one pairs up with somebody else. So how long does a plover live? We have 2 records of females who have reached 14 years. And that's really pretty interesting because that's about the same age, maximum age in the wild of a tiger. You know, think of the difference in kind of their life history strategies and so on. So 14 doesn't seem like very long, especially when you think about parrots or elephants. But for a tiny bird like that, that makes a migration twice a year of more than 1,000 miles one way, there are a lot of risks to make it live for 14 years. It's pretty amazing. We've learned about what causes them to die, about mortality, survival rates, where they winter, info on their migration routes, where they go. Do they go back to the same place where they hatched from? The answer is no, they rarely don't. They go to a new site. And we have also studied the sex ratios of hatching and fledging. So these are just a few examples of what you can do with banding. So it's very powerful. And when we first started, there was a lot of resistance. Everybody thought it was going to hurt the birds. But it's good. Okay, so some examples of research. Here is a student of mine, Abby Powell, who she was one of my first students, and she actually worked on captive rearing. And we came up with this idea that we saw nests were being flooded out. They weren't, the eggs, or they were being abandoned, and the eggs were totally okay, but we had no way of raising them. We knew they were fertile. And here's this tiny population. So if we had a strategy of being able to keep these alive, then, and raise them so that they could be turned back in the wild, we could come up with a method of increasing population, another method. And so we decided to work with killdeer and spotted sandpipers because we couldn't work with the endangered bird. And people were very nervous about this. And we wondered if one of the methods, just raising killdeer eggs in captivity, or if the spotted sandpiper could raise the killdeer eggs and potentially raise plover eggs. And so Abby came up with an experimental design where she raised some killdeer eggs in captivity. She observed the survival of killdeer eggs raised by their own parents, and then the same by spotted sandpipers. And those two species co-occur generally with plovers. So who did the best job? Well, it was interesting. The captives, of course, had the highest survival. They're protected. There aren't any predators there. And we had the right equipment. We got the right food together. And basically, they all survived and could be released back into the wild. The spotted sandpipers produced more young than the actual killdeer did. And if you know anything about killdeer, you probably could figure out why that is. Killdeer will often nest like in golf courses, people's yards, in driveways, places where they come in contact with people and their pets and so on. And so we realized then that we had a good argument for being able to take plover eggs that had already been abandoned. We weren't asking to take some that were like in a nest that was being incubated. We were just trying to do a rescue job. So we did that, and at first we did it on our own, and then it was pretty overwhelming because those little plovers eat a lot, and they need things. They need to go outside, and they need to be looked after. And so we started working with the Detroit Zoo, and a lot of things have happened. We now have a captive rearing center at Michigan Biostation. This is an outdoor pen where they get to practice feeding and going into the water and so on. We're getting a new flight cage that's going to be built here, which is going to be very cool for next summer. We've got state-of-the-art equipment, these great brooders and incubators, and there are volunteers now from more than 20 zoos in the country. So zoos from around the country have participated and sent keepers for like a week or several weeks who have made huge contributions. And it's really fun for us people who work with wild populations to be able to talk with the keepers who are like experts on incubation and chick growth and development and so on. So it's a great team to work with. So what do we know about the return rate of these captives? Well, since we started doing this in '93, we've released almost 200. And but the total returning are small, 23, which is a return rate of actual breeders of about 11%. But that has gone up from when we first started measuring it in 2008. And we've started to try and do some things like we hold them longer in captivity. And we are making sure to release them where there are other wild plovers at beaches where they are, so they can hopefully learn from them. So we're expecting, the rate to be coming up. So those that returned, 11 nested once, 6 twice, 6 nested 3 or more times. And then when you compare reproduction, though, this is pretty interesting. So they lay about the same number of eggs, but the hatching rate is not as high for the captives, and the actual number of chicks that fledge is not as high for the captives as for the wild. And we're thinking it may be that the captive birds have no experience in a nest with their parents. So they may be missing some skills, some knowledge. That's speculation. But the important thing is that we know that they recruit back, and we know that that research has increased survival of captives, so we can improve that, and they contribute. They do contribute. It's a tiny population to begin with, and those extra birds, each one counts, so that's very important. Yeah, sure. Good point. Yes. In fact, what we know is once they've nested once, their productivity is equal to the wild birds. So I should have mentioned that because that's very important. So they gained that little extra experience. And this year, I don't have the data here, but I think we released about 22 captives, and so far 11 have been reported on the wintering ground. That's 50%. People have seen them because we give them very special bands because we want to know where they are and what's happening. So that's very exciting. So here's another study, and I'm going to go quickly through these. This was a student of mine who decided she wanted to study migration, and nobody knew anything. People said, oh, plovers are nonstop migrants. They don't stop anywhere inland. Nobody knows anything about them stopping inland. And so we wanted to know, do they use migration stopover sites? How long do they remain there? Do they congregate? They have large numbers of plovers. Is the behavior different between spring and fall? And can stopover sites be protected? Lots of different questions. Well, she did this work before there were geolocators or GIS satellite transmitters, which nobody's put on a plover yet. Anyway, so she had to go to the literature, and so every state has a bird Audubon Society, typically, that has a journal. In the state of Minnesota, it's the Loon, and they keep records, spring, fall, summer, winter records. And she went through all the way back to late 1800s and wrote down every single reporting of a piping plover during migration. And she did this for all of North America, Canada, Central America, and this is what she found, and the Caribbean. When she plotted this, they do stop. These dots, you don't need to look at the colors, it doesn't really matter. One is fall, one is spring, the other is both spring and fall. But these were locations. She had to convert them all to lat long, and it's pretty impressive. Plovers are lots of places inland. We thought they were only coastal migrants, so this is during the migration season. She did some analyses that it's a hierarchical clustering that identifies kind of hotspot areas. And so this is for spring. We have another one for fall. And basically what's being highlighted are wetland areas. So we know they were showing up along rivers and along lake shores, turf grass, a lot of different places. But this just shows these are kind of these hot spots and what you can do with that kind of data. So what'd she find out? Plovers do use stopover sites, and they use a different diversity of water bodies. And there are differences between spring and fall in terms of, which areas they appear to be using. They don't stay for very long, only a day or two. And they are not congregators. Some shorebirds are there, hundreds and hundreds of shorebirds. She was finding one individual or very small groups were being reported. So that was kind of cool. So basically, they are using these stopover sites opportunistically, whether or not they're wet or not. And in the end, we couldn't justify any kind of formal protection of these sites because they're too few birds, too unpredictable. So agencies should take their money, we think, and put it elsewhere, like in the wintering grounds or breeding grounds. Maybe someday we'll find something more out about the stopover sites, and certainly that's interesting. But there's no hot spot. Well, we also were able to do a lot with the wintering ground distribution because we have these banded birds. And here are a couple of people that I've worked closely with who really helped us develop the information. And the reason that we're able to get this info is there are a lot of people in the breeding ground or the wintering ground who enjoy this as a hobby, especially since they now people have really good spotting scopes and cameras, and it's like collecting stamps. You go to the beach and you see the birds, and then you can get on the internet and you can find out who banded, where the birds came from, and you can kind of build up your little collection of knowledge. So we have a lot of colleagues in the wintering grounds and along the coast, and they took these photos, and so now they're sending us photos. We can look and we can verify. So we wanted to know first, can the resightings of these banded birds, can they help us define the wintering grounds? And what can we learn about behavior? So this is the last full year of information we have, and you can see, unfortunately, the dots aren't very good, but these are birds reported during migration, right here, this upper half. And not that many people are looking, and the birds are in funny, strange places, not like people can walk these shorelines, pick these up. But look at this, all along the number of reports we've had. These are our banded birds. So that's a hot area from the Carolinas all the way down to northern Florida. And then patches along here in western Florida and up into the Gulf areas. So yes, we know where these birds are wintering. This is a very cool record. I had to put this in for you. So last summer at 10:15 in the morning on the 22nd of July at Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, Alice Van Zorn, who works for me as a monitor, by chance took a photo of this female. And then she noticed the female was gone. Didn't see her for the rest of the day. Now this female still had young, but remember I said they leave early. So the male was there with the young. Well, a strong wind came from the north that day. And 44 and a half hours later, a person who was looking for shorebirds here in Crandon Beach State Park near Miami, by chance, 6:45 in the morning, saw this plover, took a photo, sent it to Alice, and Alice goes, "Whoa, I know that bird." So 44 and a half hours, 1385 miles, average of 31 miles an hour. So did that bird stop? Probably pretty much beelined it like this. But very cool. This is our report line. That goes right into Alice. She keeps track of all the winter records. So this is how we get this info. So the basic, things that we've learned, we know where they're nesting. They have very high site fidelity. Birds go back to the same place winter after winter. And the members of the family, the pair, they aren't together. They're not with their young. Everybody just goes off for their own winter vacation. And then the adults often will meet again in the breeding grounds. But the message is that many sites are used consistently between years. So those are very high conservation priorities. The sites are used by plovers, and they're often used by the same plovers. So that's really cool and important information. This is a student who did some other wintering work, and she's now with the DNR here in Minnesota. And she basically looked at plover habitat in the wintering grounds and tried to identify what factors are important, what attracts plovers, and why are they not in some places. I think the most interesting work she did was actually a survey with the management of the public land where plovers are for the winter. So she did a GIS analysis, and she found some things that are not any big surprise. Plovers avoid human infrastructure. You can find them in association with certain features, intertidal and total area is important. So that's not so interesting to you. But also that most of the sites, recreational activities are going on. So she did a survey of these land managers, and this is down in areas where there's huge public pressure, and these people have to manage for public access at the same time they're managing for basically biodiversity conservation. Well, what wins out? They got people screaming at them, their phones ringing. People want to drive on the beach. They want to be able to let their dogs run loose. They don't have the monitors. They don't have the money to really do the kind of job they would like. So basically, that's what they had lots of ideas. Managers identified solutions of what to do. Leash laws, enforcing those, limiting access, and so on. But they're short on money, and basically Olivia said, somehow, inaction is very dangerous because there are a lot, besides piping plovers, there's other rare species. But here's an area where conservation is focused. So this is a student of mine who just finished, and she worked on the survival, estimating survival and figuring out who survives, how long they survive. And I'm going to go fairly quickly so that so I can kind of keep within the time frame there. But she basically wanted to know what factors are going to allow these birds to survive, come back to breed, young ones to come back, recruit back into the population. We have this great photographer in Michigan. He's really amazing. He's retired. Just gives us those photos. So she looked at a lot of different factors that predicted what would predict hatch year survival. And the thing that I want to point out is this: the one big factor that's most important is that the birds that hatch earlier, that's the biggest influence on whether or not a young one is going to survive the winter and come back. And does that mean they're older, they have better reserves when they migrate? They're less predators when they're kind of growing up? We don't know exactly what that is, but not the early bird gets the worm, but kind of that idea. That early hatching is good. And then she looked at age-specific probability of first breeding for males and females. Well, there's a higher probability of females coming back and breeding at age 1 than males, and that's because actually males survive better than females, and so there's a shortage of females, and so every female that comes back finds a mate. And then she found that adult survival increased with hurricane activity and with higher populations of merlins. And she looked at merlins, the small falcon, the big threat plovers, across their general migration route and wintering route, and was able to correlate survival. And we have had a decline in survival that we think is associated with merlins. So what's important? Got to protect those early nests, because that's what's going to produce the most young who will come back to breed. Consider merlin control at selected sites, which does go on in Michigan. And it's important to protect sites throughout the end cycle. The final example I'm going to give you is a student who did a really interesting thing. This is Erin Roach. She now works for USGS at Jamestown in North Dakota. So she looked at, was thinking about the recovery process, and was thinking about, what's the current population trend, and has nesting pair distribution changed, and then what do models tell us? Can we use models? And the problem is this. What do we see? Population's going up, right? So we would say recovery, we're on our way to recovery. We know that active sites have increased from 6 to 36 since listing, since the mid-1980s. Another indicator, we're doing something right. We're producing birds, the numbers are increasing. But people who've used population models, and 2 models here, one by Plissner and Haig and one by Wemmer et al., they predict that the population is going to be gone. One of these, this paper was, quite some time ago. They're not likely to persist beyond 25 years. And so Erin started looking at that, and she said, how can this be? These models say they're going drastically. They're tanking. They're going to go extinct, but the population is growing. So this is the interesting part. I think you'll find this interesting. And this is how they finish. Okay, so this is what the population is doing. See this line? It kind of drops a little bit, started to grow. Then boom, we had a big jump, and it was a little flat. Now it's starting to grow again. And she stopped this in 2008, so it's even grown even more. We're up at 70. So she reran models that one of those other groups had run, and this is a vortex model, which zoos use. It's used by people working with wild populations. It allows you to predict the fate of an animal population. So she did that even with our kind of new data. Boom, numbers are going down. It's not going to make it. This is how, out to whatever number of years they're going to be going extinct. This is number of pairs. Then she developed her own model, which was a Great Lakes population model. Things were even worse. So why? So then she began thinking, every year we have birds that show up that are not banded, adults. And so she reran the models, and she put in 6 unbanded per year and 12 unbanded per year. And look what happens. This one, that's kind of a stable line. This is with 12 unbanded birds, and it's almost starting to mimic what we see in the wild. So what this means is we have, since 2000, between 2008 and 2014, total unbanded adults we had in the population about 56. That's a lot of birds, but 8 per year. These could be unbanded chicks that we missed, but we get most of the chicks. So that really is not a good answer. Could be Great Plains or Atlantic Coast birds coming in, but that's not very good because we are watching all the time, and there's a lot of banded birds, and we're just not seeing them. So we think that those unbanded are young of unknown Great Lakes pairs that we haven't found. Well, we think we know where birds are, but of course we don't. We know we don't know them all. And I started calculating the Great Lakes shoreline, about 10,000 miles of shoreline. That's with islands. That's about 44% the circumference of the Earth. So of course we're not checking all of that. So if this is the case, and now we're going to do the genetic work on unbanded birds, we're going to find out where they're from. And so when they are considered, in these models, then the models begin to match what we see in the wild. So the basic message then is, we do appear to be on the road to recovery. There's a lot of things we have to worry about. There's a lot of intensive babysitting. You can tell that. Will these birds ever be independent from management? It's hard to imagine. I think they could hit 150 pairs, but can we ever stop using those exposures? Do not know. So we'll have to wait and see. I have lots of people to thank, many monitors, volunteers, and so on. All of these agencies and groups have been the major funders, and then questions. That was taken by one of our volunteers in Florida. That's one of our birds, eating a marine worm. Pretty amazing. Okay, that's it. See, I'm trying to think. If I cannot tell you exactly. I'm sure that they were included in the model. They have a positive effect. The captives have led to increased numbers in the population. I can't say, I can't talk about what like the bigger picture is, because the modeling would not have included the offspring. If they would have removed the captives, you still would have had offspring in the model. So I have to check that. That's a really good question. I don't know. Yeah, Terry. So they have such strong site fidelity. How do they recolonize and also? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Great question. So they, the males come back to their same place very predictably. And if they get back in time and they get their little patch beach, that's what they're looking for. So the males are the first ones that come back. The first year breeders are slower than the experienced breeders. And so when they come back, they have to look around. And if they go back to where they hatched and there's no extra space, they may get driven off by their males, because some plovers do kind of like each other. They're drawn in. That's not a good way to put it. They're attracted to each other, probably because it's a good way to, find a mate, and it's also a measure of good habitat. But it's the young males who are the pioneers. And so every time that we've had a new site colonized, and often what's really cool is we have sites colonized that have not been used for more than 30 years. And boom, we get a phone call. There's a bird at blah, blah, blah beach, and we'll go, there hasn't been a bird there for 30 years. So I talked about that signature. They see something on the landscape and they stop and they go there. And so these are like young males who've never really wandered around, but that's what they're doing. They're wandering around. They're looking for a female. They're looking for good habitat. And if they happen to hook up, then that's how they get recolonized. So that's kind of cool. Well, sometimes they will be hanging out at a place and they don't have a spot to nest. The habitat's not quite right, so they're checking it out. They make all these little scrapes and try it out. If things aren't just right, then they leave, or if there's a disturbance. So sometimes they're traveling together, and that's how I think that's happening, because every once in a while we get a report of a male at such and such a location who's displaying, but there's not a plover for 50 miles. They think, oh, that poor guy, what's going to happen to him? And you know what happens? He hangs out, and then he leaves. He starts looking around. So, yeah, it is very much like a soap opera. We have, there's certain individuals that we have good stories about, but we know a lot what they're doing. Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Oh, you know, several different people in the different populations have looked at food, and that's a very difficult one to measure because they put out what are called sticky traps that it's like sticky kind of tape that insects fly into, and then you can estimate the abundance of insects at different sites. But they're also feeding, they go up into the vegetation, they'll pick off of the vegetation, they'll pick invertebrates, and they'll go along the shoreline, and a mat of algae will come drifting in, and these little algae beetles around there, and they'll feed on it. So people have not done any kind of convincing work, but we do worry sometimes about broods that are up along Lake Superior in Michigan, because it's cold and cold seasons, and the sites don't seem to be very productive, and the chicks weigh less. So that may be an issue. Yeah.
A couple other questions. Migration. Do you see any of the superior population flying to the Great Lakes on their way, or is it separate? No?
Where we've had reports is along western Lake Michigan, so like Waukegan, and moving up the shoreline, and then it's almost like they cut off. So we get some reports of the Great Plains birds from there, but we only have one case of a Great Plains bird that's nesting up on Lake Superior, actually right now. He's been there about 3 years. And he was banded in Manitoba, hatched in Manitoba. So I think he came up and then he kind of cut to the right when he got up to the top of the lake, what I think, and found some other plovers.
The other question I have is the population developing water there. Do you have any hope?
Oh, um, first of all, there's some great U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service coastal program money that's trying to do some habitat modification in the Duluth Superior area. And so they're very carefully, thinking about, what to do about the habitat to make it more attractive, because birds do stop there periodically. They need more birds passing through or coming up that far. And so I think if there are birds nesting at the Apostle Islands on Long Island, and there have been like 8 pairs sometimes, and we sometimes have birds nesting on Lake Michigan in Wisconsin, or we get reports like Dora Peninsula. And so if those numbers started to build up, that's when I think it'd be more likely that birds would end up in Duluth. So I would say, yeah, I think if they start to show up and if they nest and if it's favorable, like they can protect the site, that's how they would get going there. But that'd be very nice. Looks like we've done it for, one more question, and this will be the last one. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yes, I will. And this is a very touchy subject. There's with peregrine falcon recovery in Minnesota, they were basically capturing and killing great horned owls, because great horned owls were a terrible predator on peregrines. And almost any lots of endangered species, especially when they're really, really tiny populations and vulnerable, somebody says, we need to do something about the predators. So what happened is that I mentioned Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. There's an island, North Manitou Island, that's out in Lake Michigan, that typically has like 13 pairs of plovers, and they're on this one like big sand spit almost that sticks out in the lake, all very open. And merlins used to be very rare. They're actually listed as a threatened species in Michigan, although I think they're taking them off the list. And they made a recovery. Nobody knows exactly why, but they may have been affected by the same chemicals that affected eagles and pelicans and so on. Anyway, their numbers started coming up, so that there were a lot of merlins out on this island, and they were picking off plovers right and left. I mean, it was frightening, because they were getting the experienced breeders, the ones that are most valuable, and it would be just like boom, they were gone. And so the Park Service got very concerned, and the Park Service is not an agency that wants to go in killing, right? But Fish and Wildlife Service got concerned. Fortunately, I didn't have to have a role in the decision, because I really like merlins. But they decided that that's where we had this big plunge. If you were paying any attention to, it was 2009. Boom! All of a sudden, the numbers like way down, and so they decided to bring out some sharpshooters and take out some merlins, and which is what they did. And then the numbers have started coming back up. So they hire Wildlife Services, which is a USDA animal control group that deals with lots of issues with animals in conflict. And they were the ones that have removed the merlins, and they have they can only take so many, and they can only do it at a certain time, and there has to be good evidence. So there are these rules they have to operate by. But yes, that's what's going on. They don't, it's not a big, you don't see that on the front page of any newspaper. Yes. Um, yeah, well, so we have, there are some places where we suspect that gulls have been taking the young. And you've seen them take plovers? Yeah, where was that? I'm curious. Oh, wow. You, okay, so that was one of the places that I knew had happened. So are you from Canada? Oh, yeah. Wow, yeah. So we do know that gulls do periodically take chicks, and that's a very difficult one because you can't, what do you do? How do you keep gulls off beaches? One of the things that we try, the monitors are asked to remove like any dead fish, anything that gulls would be feeding on, but they like to loaf on beaches. Um, but we don't, they're not taking adults. And we do know, like up at Grand Marais, Minnesota, or Michigan, we know that's another place we've had trouble with gull predation. But very interesting to know you guys were there and actually saw that, because that was, that was a big deal. Yeah, it's the herring. We think are the ones that are, the problem. Along crows and ravens, another. Okay, I should let you guys go. If you have any questions, you can come down here. I'm happy to talk to you, and thanks for your for coming.